So do they think that your incident was before or after the other one?
I believe because I was watching them from my car, so I know it had to have been after.
Oh, so you watched it from your car before?
Yes.
Okay, so it couldn't have been the same time either. Okay,
No. So and this is like Calvin. So they left twice. When they brought Calvin and Charlie back, when they brought them back from the spaceship, it took off, and that's when I seen it go down. They like to follow the river or the roads and stuff as you use them for maps.
You were outside or inside your car?
I was inside my car.
And he was inside the car. Both of you were inside.
The car.
Okay.
And I'm looking down, and I seen Calvin and Charlie down there fishing, and so I'm looking what's going on all around me, because I had nothing else to do. So when I look off in the distance, I seen which I thought was an airplane come over towards Gaucher, come in my view, and so I'm just watching it, and I'm thinking, oh, that's a UFO. How you just see something, so I'm gonna watch that. I said,
I get distracted easily. I'm always looking at my windows like, what's that?
I said, well, I'm just gonna watch that and see what that does.
I would have done the same thing, entertainment.
Yeah, just because I was bored, and so it kind of like there's Highway 90. It followed the length of the followed the Highway 90. It stayed right there like it was a map, and it come down, and right before, we had a drawbridge back then, it's not the same bridge, and right before it got to the drawbridge, it crossed over and come down, and I told my husband, I said, I didn't know there was a little airstrip over there, because it come down like it was landing.
And that was on the other side of the river by where Charlie and
where Charlie was at. Yeah, and then it came down, and when it come down, it's come over by where they were at, and it come up behind them.
Okay.
And so it kind of like was in the marsh, but I'm thinking it's a little space place over there where they can land, landing place. But it wasn't. It was they was just hovering over the marsh.
Wow. And then what did you see happen?
Well, when I seen it coming, it come up behind them, which I didn't know that's what it was doing, because I couldn't, because it done got dark.
That's what I was wondering too. Was it kind of like, could you see very well, or was it dark?
It was dark. It done gotten dark, yeah. And it was coming up behind them. That's when Calvin said he seen the blue lights. He thought it was cops.
Yes.
I'm on this side.
Trespassing.
Yeah. I'm on this side watching from my car, and it's coming. I seen the lights, the blue lights flashing. It was like both of them, the lights were like this and blue, and it was coming up behind them. And when it got up behind them, that's what he said. He thought, well, we're in trouble, Charlie.
Okay.
But anyway, I seen it when the door opened.
How did it open?
It
like
just,
side to side? Or
like that.
Okay, like an elevator almost, but two sides.
It opened up. The bright light come through. The bright white light come through. It's very bright. And I seen the three UFO guys come out.
Aliens. Alien robots or something.
Aliens or whatever they are. But see, at the time I didn't know that's what that was.
Right.
I'm watching from a distance, not really knowing what I'm seeing.
So did it look more just like shadows almost, or?
No, it looked like people. I mean, from where I was at, I'm just thinking I'm looking at people.
The people coming out of this craft. Okay.
Yeah, well, anyway, they come out, and when they went down to where they were at, and Calvin and Charlie was at, and I seen when they brought them back, and Calvin had Calvin by the arm and had Charlie by the arm, and Calvin is slumped over. He looks like he's passed out, and Charlie, he's kind of like hanging on there. He's not as scared.
Okay.
He's not as scared as what Calvin was. Anyway, they took him up into the spacecraft, and it was like 30 minutes later. Like I said, didn't know exactly what was happening over there. I'm just watching from my car until later on, and then they come back out. They brought them out and took them back down to the waterfront, set them down where they were at before, and that's when they got back in the craft, and it took off straight up.
So how long do you think they were?
They were in there about 30 minutes.
30 minutes, okay.
And so that's when I seen it go down and come back, the spacecraft, and then it went back down, and that's when I told my husband.
I believe it. When did you first meet Calvin Parker?
The first time I actually seen him was when he got abducted.
You were there, had someone to relate to.
But everything that happened that night between Calvin and Charlie with the aliens, when the humanoids got them, I seen it all. I seen the whole thing. I seen it when it come down. I seen it from a distance when it was coming from Gaucher. It looked like to me that it had come off the water, because it come over and it started following the path of the highway.
Interesting.
And it's following the highway, because I watched it, and it came all the way down right before it got to the drawbridge, which was there at the time. It crossed over and it started coming down. And I said, "Wonder where that plane's going?" I said, "There's not no little aircraft thing over there for them to land."
Hey, welcome back to another episode of UAP Studies Podcast. We've been rocking it with the interviews lately, and today is no exception to the rule. Coming to us from the UK, of course, we have Philip Mantle. Irena Scott joins us as well. Irena, I think you're East Coast, United States. Is that correct?
I'm sort of in the Midwest in Ohio.
Nice. Okay, so we're all over the place. I'm in Vancouver, BC, or just outside Vancouver, BC. Today, we're going to talk about a case that's very near and dear to my heart, because it's one of the first cases that really piqued my interest. I think there's great, incidences that are not as well known. The Pascagoula and the Allagash incidents, for instance, I think are the two that really need to be looked into more seriously, because there's a lot of witnesses, multiple abductees, and they mentioned at different times different entities aboard the crafts, which you will find in this story as well. So we're going to talk with Philip Mantle and Dr. Irena Scott here today, because they've been investigating with Calvin Parker, which was an abductee. And basically, this story goes back in October 11th, 1973, so almost 51 years ago. Charles Hickson, which was 42 years old. Just side note here, guys, I looked at the picture of Charles Hickson at 42. I'm 42 years old. He looks like he's 68. I don't know what happens during the 70s, but the 40-year-olds look a lot better today than we did back in the day. I'm just saying, same age, and you could not tell the difference, hopefully. But Calvin Parker was only 18 at the time, and Charles Hickson was 42. And after a long day's work, I think it was 10, 12 hours, Calvin had mentioned, they decided to go do a little bit of fishing on the side of the Pascagoula River. And they weren't there very long before an event took place. And I'm going to let our guests really talk about this event. For the longest time, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were not believed. And there wasn't enough people coming forward to say they had seen anything. Although people had commented seeing something in the skies, nobody reported seeing them or seen them being taken. But that changed recently. And that's what our guests are here today to talk about, because now there's more validity to the story, more depth and layers than we've had before. And Michael, I know you're new to this subject. How much about the Pascagoula abduction case do you know?
I know very little. I mean, I've read like the Wikipedia article on it and seen forum discussions and things and a few other podcast episodes that have mentioned it, but I've never been given the full authoritative rundown. So I'm really excited to be able to kind of be the play the role of the person who's really first being introduced to this. And I hope that our guests aren't too tired of telling the story.
Well, I thought today to do something a little bit different, Irena and Philip, is what we could do is tell Calvin and Charles' story, but let's introduce Maria Blair and her husband, Jerry, to the mix and to say, okay, across the river, this is what they seen. Because for the longest time, there was nothing across the river. Now there is. So let's cover that. Let's go to the full story of everybody involved.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And thank you, gentlemen, for having us as guests this evening. So we'll jump forward in time. And in 2018, I had permission to republish Charlie Hickson's book, UFO Contact at Pascagoula, that was published in 1983. So I set out to try and find Calvin. Charlie died in 2011. Just find Calvin and ask him for an interview. So long story cut short, we make contact. He tends to trust me, and he says, I want to tell my story in full for the first time. So we ended up writing 2 books together. Well, he wrote them, I edited them. Now, Calvin went public, and there was a local journalist by the name of Karen Nelson. Karen was a bit skeptical. She came and interviewed Calvin, but she also made a film of it as well. So when you clicked onto the online article, you also got this little, 8-minute video. That ended up on YouTube. And I was reading the list of comments underneath. I mean, there was a lot. But there was one that stuck out, and it said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. So I won't say the exact words that entered my head, but I thought, golly, that's interesting. So I managed to find this person. She was a young lady. I found her elsewhere on social media. And I said, would it be possible to speak to your mum and dad? I explained who I was and why I was interested. She came back and said, yeah, it's Mr. Jerry and Mrs. Maria Blair. And here's their telephone number. So I rang them up, and Maria told us, yes, indeed, we were on the opposite side of the river that night. My husband, Jerry, worked offshore. He helped service the oil rigs out in the Gulf. And there was a little boat there to take him out, but his boss was late. So Jerry thought, I'll try and sleep in the car for a couple of hours, and they sat in the car. He's not in the best of moods. And Maria says she saw this blue thing come down the river, almost as if it was using the river as a map, as a route. Stopped over the opposite side of the river from them and did aerial acrobatics. She said at first it was as if it didn't know where it was going or if it was looking for someone. She knew the area, so she knew there was no airfield there or helicopter pad. And then they decided to walk down this small pier to put her husband's clothing onto this boat. And she said there was this huge splash in the water next to her. And out of the water came these are her words, this grey man. Scared the bejesus out of her. It went back into the water, under the water, and never came up again.
Interesting.
So she walks to runs to the boat with her husband and chucks the stuff on it. At some point, she then goes back down the pier, terrified that she's got to go back where this had happened to the car. Now, she estimated it was about 9 o'clock when this happened, but when she ran back down the pier, it was around midnight. So, I briefly spoke to Jerry. He was a lovely guy, but he never sounded to be in a good mood. But I think that was just...
He was just grumpy by nature.
That's just the way he spoke, And when Maria talked about going down this pier and this thing coming, she got very emotional. And she did say to me that she got little flashes. She said almost if she could see something else out of her peripheral vision. And she did make the comment. She says, I've often wondered if something similar didn't happen to me and Jerry that happened to Charlie and Calvin. And she said, of course, Jerry went out to work, was gone for I don't know many days or weeks. She sees Charlie and Calvin on the TV and thinks, oh, hellfire, that's last night. We were there. So then I passed her on to Dr. Scott. Irena and I had teamed up because I would end up bringing people in Mississippi and, they've got this strange sounding fella from across the Atlantic, usually ringing at the wrong time because I could never get the time difference right. So Irena and I had worked together already publishing a number of her books. So it made obvious to have someone in the States to work with. And Irena, you take up the story there with Maria Blair.
And Irena, first, what's your background?
My background's in science. It's not in ufology. I I have a PhD from a school of veterinary medicine. I worked in research and as a professor. And so I retired and then I started doing ufology.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Yeah.
He gave, Philip gave me the name of Maria and the phone number. And this was my first person I interviewed. And so I called her. And first of all, I talked to Jerry, and Jerry was a skeptic. And what he mainly said was he heard a big splash. And then he said something about a blimp. And then he very quickly gave the phone to Maria. And at that time, Maria, she was just confused about the whole thing, but emotional. And she said that they were waiting in the car and she saw this thing flying around. She didn't have any idea what it was. And there was no landing strip or anything there. And she kept saying she thought the pilot was lost or something was wrong with the pilot, that he was just, going around not doing anything. And so then she said that she and Jerry walked down the pier and he was ahead of her. And she said this thing splashed up and it looked like a person. And then it went back down and she couldn't figure out why it didn't come back up for air. And I asked her, is it a porpoise? And she said, no. Is it a fish? No. She said it looked just like a man. And so she was very confused and she was very, very emotional, but she didn't know why she was emotional. So they went on down to the ship like about 9. And then she said he came back at about 12. And that immediately made me wonder why they were there that long. But anyway, she was very terrified and she ran back to the car and jumped in the car and left. And so I talked to her for about a year or two, and you could tell she was just loaded with emotions, but she didn't know why she was emotional. And so then, unfortunately, Jerry became sick, and he died a little bit later, but he had been a skeptic all his time. And when he was kind of knew he was going to die and was very sick, he told her that they had been abducted and that he had been in contact with these aliens, but he didn't tell her. And so I guess he was trying to protect her, but this would be funny to find out your husband, who's been a skeptic all this time, and
trying to protect you. Yeah.
And says, well, this happened. We were abducted. He remembered details about it. He remembered the beings, and he remembered watching him swim back after the abduction was over, back toward the other pier. And so anyway, then they verified it quite a bit. They sent videos to Philip and talked to him on the phone. And Jerry said that he had not told the truth and that, he didn't want people to call him crazy and things, which, he was working. So of course he wouldn't. So he had hid it. But then he had some kind of contact with these aliens. And she said he had been married a couple of times and she was kind of concerned about all this.
Okay.
So then.
So just a side question, Irena, do you think Jerry was a regular abductee and maybe that had something to do? I mean, these things tend to look for specific people. What I thought was weird about the Charlie Hickson, Calvin Parker is that I don't think they've had a previous abduction like in their past, unless I'm mistaken. But you're saying yes, Philip, I can see you shaking your head. Did they have an experience in the past?
What I'll say about Jerry is, sorry to interrupt, Irena, but he was so adamant he was going to have a small operation and he wasn't sure if he was going to survive. And he made his wife, Maria, phone me from the hospital to tell me. And he also made her film him on the cell phone. So we have a little video of Jerry sitting on his hospital bed with stickers still on from his ECG saying, I lied. I saw the same as my wife. And in fairness to Maria, when he started to talk about this, even though he was ill, she said, you've got some goddamn explaining to do, Yeah. And what Irena did, she recorded all the information, whether it be on Facebook Messenger or text or phone. And when you read Jerry's story, it sounds like what he's talking about things in the plural rather than a one-off. You
Multiple
know,
times,
it gives that impression, you know. And as everybody will say, he sadly passed away. He gave us like a deathbed confession, but it wasn't an overnight thing. This was spread out from when he knew he was going to die, you know, until he eventually did.
How long was that?
It was weeks, maybe months. You know, it wasn't a couple of days. It was spread out. I mean, they had him on a ventilator in the end. You know, he was that ill. And now after he died, at some point, Maria mentioned hypnosis to us, and we said, forget about it, Maria. You're still grieving over your husband, you know. Mm-hmm. So she came back to us again sometime later. So I said, well, I'll take a look. So what I did, I contacted a number of hypnotherapists in the area, found one that was willing to do it and would come out to the location, you know, your house or wherever. So we arranged it at Calvin's house because he'd had hypnosis before. He'd now met Maria, you know, and he'd met Jerry, so they were on friendly terms. But we didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything. Just a date, time, location, and that's it. So she put Maria under hypnosis, which we had filmed professionally. And again, she's very emotional, and she talks about there being interested in her DNA and eggs, and wanting to create beings that could walk among us, you know, unnoticed, so to speak. Now, what she did say afterwards, this is her opinion, it's not a fact, is she believes that her and Jerry were the target that night because they were due to be there at that time and at that location. And Jerry also talked about things plural, as if things had happened in the past. Whereas Charlie and Calvin only decided to go fishing on their way home from work. So they weren't supposed to be there. So she looked upon Charlie and Calvin as almost like collateral damage, you know?
Right.
Though for years, they've been the sort of central or publicly central figures of this case.
Yeah, yeah.
And it might not have been, right? It might have just been a side abduction, but the main abduction we never heard of. Yeah.
No, so, you know, after Jerry died, you know, it was hard to get Maria at times. She was living with her daughter. Daughter's not in the best of health. So towards the end of last year, I finally got her pinned down, and a colleague of ours out in Ocean Springs in Mississippi called Chelsea Norton Prince agreed to film her just on an iPhone. I sent her a list of questions, and Maria talks about what happened again. But what she does say is she said, I saw what happened to Charlie and Calvin from the car. But she said, at the time, I thought it was men doing it. She was completely befuddled by what was happening. She thought this thing that came down was other men. Because she said, I saw three men-like things come out of it. You know, and at a distance, that's what they look like, you know?
Just for reference, Irena and Philip, how wide is this river? Like, how detailed could she see?
In parts, it's huge. That's why there's a shipbuilding on it, and it goes out into the Gulf. At other parts, it's not. So we're estimating, I don't know, less than a mile.
Okay.
You know, it's hard to be exactly precise, but it's not a huge, great distance. And there is some, it would be right to question that distance, how much she could see from there, how clearly could she see. Those are very legitimate questions that we've asked as well. And she said she saw it all. She reiterates seeing this thing come down the river and floating around. It came down behind Charlie and Calvin. And then, of course, is her own encounter. And she even claimed she'd had another sighting since then, you know, in recent times. So make of it what you will. I mean, these people didn't, what people have said, that after the 15 minutes of fame, well, no, because they didn't come forward. It was only that little message who was by her daughter, actually, her youngest daughter, on YouTube, and the fact that I saw it and responded to it, that we found Maria and Jerry.
It was meant to be. Yeah, it was meant to be.
Otherwise, we probably never would have done.
Yeah.
And so, again, make of your story what you will.
Were her reports about their intentions to take her genetic material or whatever. Was that something that she said during regressive hypnotic therapy, or was that something that she? Okay.
During the hypnosis. I mean, I know there's people who, disregard hypnosis, and they have their rights to do that, of course. This was Maria that wanted to do this, not us.
Sure, yeah.
So we obliged her. And what we've done with our book, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, is that we tell the Blair story in full, including a transcript of Maria's hypnosis. Because had we not done so, we could be accused of hiding something, So Irena and I decided whatever information we gather, we'll publish it all and allow others to judge for themselves. While we had the opportunity, and we had the hypnotherapist, a few weeks later, we hypnotized Calvin. He'd done it before. Calvin told the same story again. There was no apart from one thing. The hypnotherapist now knew about the subject matter, so we couldn't hide that from her anymore. Mm-hmm. And I sent her a couple of questions. One of those questions was, ask Calvin, before anything starts, while he's still stood there with his fishing rod, and his line in the water, just to describe the scene in front of him. So he does. And he says, over there is the bridge that goes over the river with the cars. He even described this little boat going out, and he could even tell you the name of it. It had a company name on the side of it. And just before he finishes answering that question, he says, oh, there's two figures on the other side of the river. Now, is that Maria and Jerry, or is it somebody else, or was it a mistake? Did it look like two figures, but in reality it was two posts of wood or whatever? I don't know. But that's what he said. And if you don't listen carefully enough, you'll miss that. So again, we have the full transcript of Calvin, his hypnosis in the new book. It's not the first time he's been under hypnosis, and you can read it for yourself. But I just found that interesting. I just wanted to know to set the scene. I wasn't expecting him to say anything. I just wanted him to set the scene before anything goes off. And
you didn't ask him about other people. He specifically volunteered that.
No, I never mentioned other people. I just said, describe what he sees in front of him.
Of course, that doesn't prove anything, but that's strong corroboration, right? I mean, that's a significant piece of memory, especially.
One of the reasons they asked is because he told me about the boat before, and the boat's called Noah. But I think that was the acronym of the company's name. And he even spelt it out for me. It was just the initials of it. So I can't remember off the top of it, but it's
National
Noah.
Oceanic Atmospheric Administration?
I don't know.
It would be significant if it were a National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration boat, because that's a scientific data collecting organization.
There you go.
Records of where they were.
But Calvin had already told me about that before, and he repeated it under hypnosis with no elaborations, But again, gentlemen, make of what you will. As for did Charlie and Calvin have past experiences? The answer would be they both claim to, yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
During our research, guys, and we didn't know this, things kept cropping up. We found out that Charles Hickson had been under hypnosis with Bud Hopkins twice.
Oh, wow.
In the 1980s. And these were several years apart. Not only did we find that out, I got copies of the hypnosis tapes, and we transcribed them. And then in one of our previous publications.
But Hopkins is, of course, the sort of grandfather of UAP hypnotic regression.
Absolutely.
Studies, right?
Yeah. And Charlie said he had two little encounters when he was a young fella. That was strange. They weren't as in your face as what happened in 1973. Calvin said a similar thing. And Calvin also went under hypnosis with Bud Hopkins in 1993. And we have all these recordings. We have them all. And
are those available anywhere for listeners to?
Not at the moment. I'm hoping they will be by the end of the year.
You know what, too, Philip, we were talking about this before we started the podcast, but if we get, I know you have some of the videos from the regression sessions with Calvin that you provided. So if it'd be possible, maybe we could tag that at the end of this podcast, so then the viewers and listeners could see that for themselves.
I might not be able to do that because I'm working on something with someone.
No worries.
but they will become available.
Darcy Weir, right? You're working with my boy Darcy Weir.
I never heard of him.
Never heard of him. Complete newbie.
But
So
what I tell you, what I want to just while we're on the topic of hypnosis, back in 1973, when these events happened, two people appeared on the spot. One was Dr. James Harder from Apro, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and of course, Dr. Hynek. And they were the main investigators who came down. Now, what Harder did, a couple of days after the event, he put both of the guys under hypnosis. Calvin only briefly, because Calvin was so disturbed by it, there's nothing they could do with him. It was a gibbering wreck.
Yeah. He was only 18, right? So
yeah. Now, remember this, Apro sent Dr. Harder there. They paid for him to go. So we thought, if we can find the Apro files, surely there'll be something in there. They were in Nevada for years in limbo. The people that had them would not let people have access to them, and they didn't really want them. They were a couple, Brian and Tina. Tina died a couple of years back. Brian, out of the blue, went to David Marler in Albuquerque, New Mexico. David runs the National UFO Historical Record Center, and he donated all of the Apro files, tapes, videos, you name it, legally, free of charge, into David's care. Now, I've known David for a number of years. I've been talking about various things, and he announced it. He told me he announced it. So I thought, Apro files. And within a couple of weeks, David had emailed and said, I haven't found any paperwork yet. However, I have found 5 audio recordings, all from that time period. One of which is Calvin Parker under hypnosis on October the 14th, 1973. So 3 days after the event, and the hypnotherapist or the hypnosis is Dr. James Harder. And I have that recording. I have transcribed it. And we also have Dr. Hynek interviewing the sheriff, Sheriff Fred Diamond, because Charlie and Calvin ended up in the sheriff's office that night and were recorded. Yep, they were recorded separately and then secretly together. So those recordings are also in amongst this.
Yeah.
So,
and when you listen to them, it sounds like this really happened. There's no faking it.
What is interesting, guys, is when you hear Charlie Hickson telling the sheriff, this is what happened to us tonight. You know, he's in the sheriff's office and they've been given a warning. If you guys are trying to pull a stunt here, you're going to spend some serious time in jail. I'll tell you now. So when you compare his testimony in the sheriff's office with the hypnosis, there is no difference. The hypnosis did not bring out any other fantasies or fictional accounts. So it's the same story. And
yes,
we also have a recording of Dr. Harder giving a press conference. And these things have never been heard anywhere. And we now have them.
The concern that I think is reasonable to have about hypnosis is not that hypnosis itself is an unreliable way of doing introspection or sort of recounting memory, but that the hypnotists themselves, if they're not properly trained or operating ethically, might guide the person into sort of, I mean, you can implant memory, false memory in people, or you can guide them.
Well, my argument is that, they'll say, oh, well, I don't use leading questions. By the very fact that you turn up as a UFO researcher is a leading question before hypnosis even starts.
Good point.
So what you try and do is compare testimony before they were hypnotized with the hypnotic testimony and see if there's any real big differences. I mean, every time you retell a story, you never tell it exactly the same way. There's little slight differences. And there isn't no big differences in them. It's just like he's under hypnosis and he's telling the same again.
Sure, but the fact that you're doing hypnotic, sort of doing a hypnotic regression as a UFO researcher, in almost all of the cases, the person who's going under is the person who's initiated or expressed an initial claim that they had this experience. So if we were putting if we were just grabbing people off the street and putting them under hypnotic regression as UFO researchers, that would be clearly objectionable because they would be expected to do this. But if a person has already said that, and if you can look at the transcript and see that the hypnotist is using non-leading questions and they're good protocols, they're ethical protocols for how to do this, you have every reason to think.
Well, I asked Calvin about the use of regressive hypnosis because by now we found out he'd been under hypnosis, 4 or 5 times, and I said, "Well, of any use to you, Calvin?" He says, "No." I said, "Why?" He says, "Well, I could remember it all anyway." So, and that was Calvin. He'd just been honest, Right. But the point is, this is, you can take this information apart, but it's new historical information on the case, that we'd never heard before. And here you have Dr. Hynek interviewing the sheriff, and what is interesting, and it's peculiar to me because as far as we knew, there was just Hynek and the sheriff on this recording, and out of the blue comes a third voice, and it's an Englishman, but we have no idea. There's no name on the tape. As far as we were concerned, it was Hynek and the Sheriff Fred Diamond. But there's an Englishman. So when I've transcribed it, I've just give the initials EM, Englishman, because I've no idea who it is. I couldn't tell you, and it sounds like
contribution to the conversation. Do they have any a particular take or?
No, they're just querying the sheriff about what happened. Who said what, who's gone where can we get this information from? And this English fella, he chips in, and it sounds like he's rustling some papers, as if he's got a notebook or something like that. So I'm making an assumption that he may be a journalist, and he's somehow got himself into this conversation. Because it's not a private. You can hear cups and saucers in the background, people chattering in the back. So it sounds like they're in a cafe or something of that nature. So it's in public, but it's fascinating. It's part of history.
Yeah.
And
so now I have a question here, Irena. You start working with Maria Blair. I'm guessing Jerry died, and then she wanted to know more about what took place with Jerry at that location. What was your next step in that process, Irena? Like, what did you do to try to move this along and gain more information on her perspective?
Well, I kept writing to her, but he had just died, and I didn't want to be intrusive under that condition.
Right.
And so I just waited, and then Philip hired got a hypnotist later. She wanted hypnosis, but it wasn't the time to do it then. And I think she was real surprised. And I think she was kind of worried because her husband had been married to several other women. And I think she was kind of worried about her eggs and whether he was transmitting, anything that could, cause their children to be hybrids or something.
Good assumption at that point, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think Maria struggled after Jerry died, to be honest, in a variety of ways. I don't want to go into anything personal, but she struggled. For example, Irena and I are consultants on a new documentary that's already been made. It's with a company in London, and they were out filming in Pascagoula and surrounding areas. But one of the people we wanted to get on camera was Maria, and we couldn't contact her, so she will not appear in it. That's why I had Chelsea Norton Prince get her on camera while later on when we had the opportunity. And she just had a tough time after her husband died, and we have to respect that, and but she's back in touch. We've been back in touch in these last few days. Her daughter's not in the best of health still, so again, contact on a regular basis may not be that easy because she's got other things to do, not avoiding us or anything like that. But like I said, in 2019, a charity in Pascagoula called Main Street Pascagoula raised some money to put a historical marker near the site of the encounter. And that's where Calvin met Jerry and Maria Blair for the first time.
Oh, wow.
And at this point, they were only telling about seeing this blue light come filtering down. They hadn't revealed a great deal more. And they did a little news interview, on camera. And Maria's mainly talking. Jerry's, again, a bit grumpy. He's smoking his cigarette, He says a little bit, but she's there on the pier saying it came down here and we saw this and we saw that. So they became friends in that respect. But none of us knew what else was coming. We didn't suspect anything else. But Jerry went on to tell us. And when you see his video, so it's only recorded on a cell phone. For me, it's quite moving. This guy is going to have a little operation. And he doesn't know if he's going to survive. So he insists. And I mean, he insisted she'd bring me there and then. And I know what the operation is because I've had exactly the same procedure. And then
it was a heart operation. You mentioned an ECG or an EEG, I think.
ECG. He was having a pacemaker fitted, which I have. So he had the little stickers on with a little metal thing where they've connected the cables up to him, and he's got no shirt on. And again, the dialogue from that is in the book, not the actual pictures or anything like that. Although we have permission from Maria to use it, we thought, well, we'll just put the information there. People can, use their own imagination what it looked like. We may share it later, but the information from it is there in print anyway. And it's quite moving. It really is. And Jerry said, I lied. I saw the same as my wife, but I lied and said I didn't. And, all these marbles were there. This was a heart condition. I know how he feels because I've got a heart condition. I've had heart problems for over 20 years. But as for Calvin, when we told him all this, even with them just seeing the thing come down the river, he felt vindicated.
Yeah.
As if to say, almost like, I'll give you the ufological equivalent of whatever the middle finger is. I told you we weren't
middle
lying.
Finger, but yeah.
I told you we weren't lying. Now perhaps you'll believe us.
Sure.
And then, of course, Maria and Jerry weren't the only ones. They saw the most of what happened, or they claim to have seen most, whichever way you want to pitch this. But another example, Calvin was doing a book signing in Pascagoula, just a little local thing, no big deal. An old boy come up, said, "Can I buy a book, Mr. Parker?" Waynett's there. She, he signs it. She takes the money, and he says, "Oh, by the way, I saw that thing that night," and off he goes. I mean, he's gone. Luckily for us, someone was taking photographs, and we have a picture of this gentleman buying his book. We put it on social media. A couple of days later, someone said, "I know who that is." I said, "Well, can we talk to him, please?" I'll ask him. Yes. And it was Mr. Lewis Lee. Mr. Lee was on the opposite side of the river that night at work in the shipyard. He was a crane operator. And he said, "Philip, as soon as I got in my cab, which was about 10 feet or so off the ground, I said, I see this damn thing out over the water, not high in the sky, out over the water." He said, "Never seen anything like it in my life." And he only took his eyes off it because his colleague down below was shouting at him. I don't know if it was broken or he had something on the end of his crane and he wasn't watching what he was doing. So when I looked back, it was gone. So I said to Mr. Lee, "Did you report it to anybody?" He said, "Well, I told my family." He said, "But Philip, this is 1973. There is no Ghostbusters. You can't phone Ghostbusters. Who are you going to call?"
Yeah.
And then like a lot of others said, we saw Parker and Hickson either on the TV or in the newspapers, and he thought, well, that was the same night I saw that damn thing, But nobody knew apart from his family until we spoke to him. Again, he didn't step forward. He just made a passing comment to Charlie and Calvin. Now we have Mr. Lee's testimony in the book. Sadly, he has passed away since we wrote the book, or since we interviewed him, I beg your pardon. So there's a little memorial to him, and a couple of others also passed away. But he wasn't alone. So things then start to mount up.
So when it comes down though to Maria and Jerry, so Maria described that she saw them get taken, and then it went straight up or whooshed by, and it was about a half an hour until they got dropped back off. A lot happened while they were during that half an hour. Calvin Parker at some point thought he was going to die because they were draining him of blood and putting something else in him, and I mean a scary half an hour. But what happened with Maria and Jerry then? Like, were they taken directly afterwards? Could you describe what their experience was?
Well, I'll leave that to Irena, because she dealt more with Maria and Jerry than I did.
Oh, absolutely. Let's hear it.
Well, Maria said that when her memory for a long time was just of this humanoid flopping up in front of her and going back down, and her wondering why it didn't come up to breathe. And that she remembered that for about 2 years. Then after he said they were abducted, well, she remembered vaguely more, but she didn't remember being on board exactly. And she thought that that they had been abducted right after Calvin and Charlie, and then that she said she saw the thing fly away, and I think they said they saw the thing fly away or disappear or something. And so she thought that maybe they were unconscious and returned to their spots, but that they didn't become conscious until it flew away. But he said he saw the beings swimming back across the river toward the Calvin and Charlie.
Oh,
And
really?
so, yeah.
Wait,
And
okay. So let me just get this straight, Irena. They're on the pier. Something weird happens. Obviously, it's about 9 o'clock, but they didn't come back to their position till 12. They saw something weird pop out of the water. All of a sudden, they get dazed, and he sees entities swimming away from them towards the opposite side of the Pascagoula. So there's entities in the water. There's not in a craft or individually in the water.
Well, Maria, as you know, said to me she thought she saw something out of her peripheral vision. And it turned out it wasn't out of her peripheral vision. She actually had her eyes closed and was just squinting.
Okay.
So she got little snippets of what these things look like. She got a vague description of them and of this metallic thing. And she said the others were down the other end with Jerry. And Jerry even referred to one of them as the doctor. And he says, I've kept my eye on him. I'll keep my eye on him. As if one of them was in charge, so to speak, for want of a better word, you know. And so these little fleeting things that she vaguely remembered seemed to fit into place. And she said they just controlled her mind. You know, they just controlled her mind, and that was it.
Yeah.
And she said, as soon as they got hold of my mind, I was out. I was out. So I didn't really have chance to see a whole lot of what was going on because they were in control and I was out cold, you know. But she saw these little vague things as well, and they kind of to make sense now, whereas before they hadn't. So it wasn't out of her peripheral vision. She screwed her eyes up because she said that the light from this thing was very bright as well. That's why she's got up, and she's scared. You know, she's scared, absolutely petrified. And
in your interviews with them, did either of you get a sense as to whether they had any skepticism about the sort of medical nature of the apparent medical nature of their experience? In other words, did they seem to totally believe that this is exactly what was going on?
Not at all. As Irena pointed out, Jerry said it's nonsense. I don't believe any of this, you know. And he told Maria not to say anything. He said they'll think we're all nuts. And
But he believed it happened. He believed that he had these experiences,
Maria,
not that the explanation for it was true.
Yeah, Maria said, when they saw this and what have you, we never thought UFOs or aliens. We didn't know what the hell it was,
Yeah.
She still thought this was something that men had been up to, because it was something she'd never seen in her life before.
Sure.
And obviously it wasn't men. And, she now takes a different stance, so to speak. And that's up to her, of course. She has the right to believe what she likes. All we're doing is telling people what we have uncovered, and whether you want to believe it or not is another matter. Like Calvin would often say, I don't care whether people believe me or not. But he said, if they call me a liar, they're in big trouble. So there was a difference,
Well, something that fascinates me about this case, and we'll figure out what happened to Maria and Jerry aboard that craft. But it's the amount of entities involved in this, because they're described differently. There's the robot-looking ones with the elephant skin. There's a female entity type taking care of Calvin. I don't know about Charlie's or Charles. But how does that differ from what Jerry and Maria went through? Like, they
didn't report any female entity, just creatures that seemed similar, if not the same, to what Calvin and Charlie had described. But Maria finds it difficult to describe them because of her eyes were squinted up, and she said this thing was literally right up in her face.
Right.
And to get a detailed description of something that's standing right in front of you is impossible, of course. And then she said, bang, click, they had control of my mind. And that was it. And she just saw her husband Jerry a bit further down the pier with the others. The others were down there, and it's just a glimpse of what's happening, and she remembered this brightness, this metallic thing. And that was it, she didn't say an awful lot more under hypnosis, to be fair. There was and she took her quite a while between question and answer. And she was, again, quite emotional in spots as well. And like I say, we have it all on film, and which I'm glad we did. And it's just a fascinating part of the story. The story then becomes that much bigger, because it's not just Charlie and Calvin. You've got two people on the other side of the river who claim similar things. Not only they claim similar things, they claim they saw what happened to you as well, And
that's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It is. But then, one of the problems, so to speak, one of the criticisms back in 1973, there is the bridge that goes right over the river. This fishing spot is not in the Mississippi swamp. It's right next to Highway 90. In 1973, it was a bit of a dump. People would go and throw their trash there. But nonetheless, there was buildings behind them. It was
wasn't remote. Yeah.
No. And the criticism back in 1973 was, nobody on the bridge saw anything. Silly statement. As far as we know, nobody on the bridge has come forward and said they've said anything. It's a different thing. However, we interviewed a chap called Charles Rusty Anderson, who was driving over the bridge that night with his wife. And he said, I saw this blue thing down below me, Philip. He said, it was so low, I thought it was going to crash. And he said, I only watched it for about 30 seconds, not long. But 30 seconds is a long time, The next day, he went to visit his aunt who lived down by the river, and she said to him, you never guess what I saw last night. Now, Mr. Anderson, this will give you an idea of things. Mr. Anderson was interviewed for the documentary that Irena and I have been working on. And he put a little post on Facebook, been interviewed for this documentary. I mean, one line. And there's comments underneath, and there's a lady's comment. No name similar to Mr. Anderson's, entirely different. And she said, I saw it that night. So I contacted her. Her name, if I can remember it correctly, is Pamela Rayleigh Eves. And she said, I was putting my children to bed, and I went to close the curtains, and where our house is situated, you can see out across that area, see this blue light. Thank you very much. Nothing spectacular. However, Pamela is a cousin of Mr. Anderson. and he saw it from the bridge, but neither of them knew of the other's sighting down the years, and that fascinated me. You've got family members didn't even know what each other had seen, let alone Joe Public,
Well, I think a lot of people in the public who aren't sort of well appraised of the massive amount of UAP case studies and evidence that there are, a lot of people assume that, well, anybody who saw something really bizarre would go out and just tell lots of people about it and report it. But if you put yourself in that position, the psychological incentives to not tell people are very strong. I mean, you have self-doubt, you have questions about whether people would take you seriously, or if,
in 1970s, that's amplified by 1,000 times.
Well, yeah, I mean, we had another gentleman we interviewed, and he said he saw Charlie and Calvin on 2 different TV channels. One took it fairly seriously, the other just made a damn fool of him. And he said there was no way on earth I was going to risk that, somebody making a fool out of me. I just wasn't going to do it. But then you see in 2018, Calvin steps out of the shadows, tells his story. He's interviewed first locally, treated with respect. He then does a few conferences. He's interviewed internationally, again, treated with respect. And people are then coming of an age as well, where they couldn't, I haven't got that many more years left. I couldn't care less if somebody wants to poke fun at me. It don't matter anymore. But things have changed. Things have changed since 1973. So some came out of the woodwork and spoke to us. Others we found just by being inquisitive and a bit of detective work and so on. And they continue to this very day. I think since our book came out, Irena's interviewed 3 people. And we have their statements yet to be published. We don't know where the hell to publish them, to be honest, at the moment, but we will do. We will do.
I have a question then for the both of you. We've been talking about the abduction phenomenon being around almost at the same time as us sighting them in the sky. But we're so far away right now from having the government or even media cover this aspect of UAPs. They're only worried about stuff in the sky, stuff in the water. But there is physical evidence. I think the cattle mutilation is a very solid evidence of something weird going on. The abduction phenomenon, the amount of people that are claiming to be abductees, it's a mental illness that is rampant throughout the world, equally spread across the world, same visual, same experience, or it's really happening. My concern is, of course, the support for these people. I mean, Calvin and Charles, they didn't have that support. I'm pretty sure Maria and Jerry didn't have that support. And it's super important because we don't know the amount of people. It could be in the millions, even within your country, the States or the UK. Everybody seems to be having these experiences, and we're not excluded from it. Like, it's worldwide. So do you think this sort of research, like what you guys have done, could that play a factor in future, government sort of admitting that these cases are valid and that they date back?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, Irena and I had a different title for the book. It was only a working title. We hadn't, and then I watched the courtroom drama one night, and the lawyer saying we've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and then it bump. And that's what where the title comes from. We've argued if you took all the evidence and all these witnesses into a court, we could probably prove something really out of the ordinary happened that night. We could never prove they're being abducted by aliens. And we're not saying that. We're saying something extraordinary took place. What is it? Now, if you look at the recent government activity, shall we say, and the setting up of, I can't remember its full title, but Apro.
Right.
The
resolution office.
That's it. But they seem to be only interested in observations by military aviators.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I've asked the question, and nobody's answered me this yet. What happened if you would have a military aviator on duty, not necessarily flying, but they're not always in the air, are they? Mostly on the ground. What would happen if a military aviator contacted Apro and said, I've had an abduction experience? Do they have a protocol to investigate that? Or would they just dismiss it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the answer, because the way I look at it, they should have. They want, military people to report their sightings to them. Surely they are aware of the encounter phenomena. Therefore, surely they should have a protocol with how to deal with one of these, because it's going to come sooner or later. And what you'll see from what I respectfully call the disclosure lobby, none of them, Mr. Grush included, have mentioned abductions anywhere. You see, almost if they're trying to pencil it out with UFO history.
Yeah.
Leslie King admitted in an article she'd written for somebody that she had purposely omitted certain things to try and give the phenomena more credibility. Well, we've tried that before. Go back to Kenneth Arnold in 1947, Flying Saucers. The Air Force, when they became involved, we don't like that title. We've got a new one, Unidentified Flying Objects. That was the Air Force that came up with that acronym. Now they've come up, we want to make it more credible. We'll call it something else. Well, it's the same cake with the same recipe, but just with a different name.
Because it has baggage, though, right? Like the UFO. I mean, they made fun of it since 1947. So they can't keep UFO now. They have to change the name because they put so much baggage and negative, content in regards to this. So I have no choice.
So we are hoping that this is a book that can be read by anyone, whatever level of interest you may or may not have. You can go as deep as you want, or you can just think, it's a great story. But we are hoping that it's an example of how you can investigate one of these cases. Because it's 1973, it's not the Stone Age, And one of you gentlemen mentioned Calvin about his on-board encounter in 1973, and he said that he had something stuck in his foot, and they were sucking the life out of him. Well, Charlie also said, when these creatures first got hold of him, he felt a pinch in his arm. Now, when I started working with Calvin, I said to him, have you got any photographs, Calvin, or documents? I mean, anything. Nope. I lost it all in Hurricane Katrina. We were under 10 or 12 feet of water, even pictures of his children. Gone.
Oh, wow.
So I said, okay, one of my jobs is to put out a blanket request for anything. Have you got anything on Pascagoula? News cuttings, letters? Obvious place to start was the Centre for UFO Studies, because it was formed later in 1973 by Dr. Hynek. They sent me a file, PDF file, which was mainly newspaper cuttings, but in the middle of it is a one-page typewritten, so it's written on an old typewriter, and it's dated October the 13th, 1973, so 2 days after the encounter, and it's called Puncture Wounds. And it describes stripping Charlie and Calvin down to their underwear and giving them the once-over. And inverted commas, they found puncture wounds on Charles Hickson's arm and puncture wounds on Calvin Parker's foot. Now, these two gentlemen had recounted feeling these minor injuries. It also mentioned some photographs were taken, but they weren't there. So we got this document. So I asked Calvin, who the hell examined you? So it was Dr. Harder. He wasn't a medical doctor, but that's what he did. He didn't examine them. He just gave them a once-over. About, 2 years later, the same gentleman at QFOS who'd sent me these documents emailed me, said, Philip, I've been going through some files today. I wasn't looking for these, looking for something else, but I assume you have them anyway, but I thought I'd better send you them. Hey, presto, it's the photos of these minor injuries that are mentioned in this letter. And there you have Charlie Hickson's forearm with these marks on them and Calvin Parker's foot. And we know which is which because they're photographs and they've got the names on the back of the photographs. So we have a scan of back and front. They're not laser precision scars or anything like that. They are minor injuries. But minor injuries of which both gentlemen provided in their verbal testimony. Then we have Dr. Harder's letter, and then the photographs. So we have in our opinion, rightly or wrongly, we have a physical component to this encounter. Because it left minor injuries on the two gentlemen in question, you know? And I've got to tell you, when the photographs came, I was sat on my computer and my wife thought there's something wrong because I just sat there and stared at them. You know, I've gone quiet for a change. And I never thought and then, of course, that it's all in the book. They are there and they are published for the first time. You can make of them what you will. But again, it's evidence we uncovered and we have published it accordingly.
Well, almost 51 years ago, and you guys are still finding some credible witnesses and amazing story. And the story keeps getting better and better because you realize that it involved more key players. The one, again, for me, which is huge, is the multiple species, the multiple sightings of entities, not only in the water, in the craft itself, or outside the craft, grabbing people and putting them back in place. But there's always a common denominator on these abductions is that they numb the mind. It's almost like you become a zombie, like you're aware of what's happening, but you can't do anything about it. It's almost like you're stepping out for a second. And I could only imagine what that does, but it's frustrating because then it gives, I mean, sort of in a way, free will. We don't have free will. And if they're around, they're able to do this to large groups of people as well. There's been many incidences where a large group of people are captivated or numbed out by an event. So that's the scary bit. It's knowing that we're not talking equal terms with these entities. We're not. You know, they come and go as they please and they don't answer to us. So that's the scary bit about this. And this is what I love about Calvin, is that I talked to him about another later episode that he had, and he managed to punch one of these things several times. And he's the only person that I know that physically assaulted an entity. He's the only one that I've ever talked to that physically punched one of these entities.
Well, Calvin, you know, was a tough guy.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And, you know, he was one of two brothers. His brother Ricky was younger than him. He said Ricky was the brains, I was the brawn. And if you picked on my brother at school, you were in big trouble. He wasn't one to start a fight, but I think he finished plenty of them.
Yeah.
And that's why I think in some respects the encounter traumatized him to such an event, because he was a young, strong, physical guy, used to hard work, you know, wasn't afraid of anybody.
To control himself, his environment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then all of a sudden he is rendered completely helpless by this event. And they do things to him that under normal circumstances, he would have killed you if he'd have tried. You know, if you'd have tried to remove his lower clothing and immobilize him, he would have beat the living daylights out of you, you know?
Yeah.
But yet he could do nothing about it. And I think that's scared him more than anything, was a complete lack of control. Whereas Charlie was different. Charlie had been a veteran. He was in the army, fought in Korea, fought in some very fierce battles. And Charlie, in his own book, said that he used his wartime experience to help him, you know, because at one point on board this thing, he thought the creatures were going to kill him. So he's saying to himself, if you're going to kill me, get on with it, you know. But then he thought back to one of the battles he was in. They were pinned down by enemy gunfire, and he thought he was going to die. And his commanding officer said to him, don't worry, stay calm. We'll find an opportunity to get out of it. And they did, of course. So he used that. Well, Calvin didn't have any of that, you know. He didn't have any of that to fall back on. And Calvin went home after a few days. He didn't live in this area, you see. He didn't know it. He lived 200 miles away. And he ended up in hospital. He just started shaking one night and could not stop. And his brother Ricky took him to the hospital, you know. And if there's anybody listening tonight who can remember the TV series The Hulk in the 1980s, Dr. Bruce Banner, the Hulk. Yeah. Dr. Bruce Banner, you know, his alter ego was the Hulk, of course. And he was stalked by a journalist. So, you know, he would have an adventure in whatever town. The journalist would come sniffing around. He'd move on to the next town. Calvin did that in real life, although he just didn't turn into a big green monster. And he literally did that. He even worked in one town where he changed his name. And his boss called him in one day and says, "You're fired." He says, "What for?" He said, "Because your name doesn't match your national insurance number you have. We call it social security number. Doesn't match." So he got the sack. And his wife eventually got fed up with that. They were separated for a while. They got back together. But of course, Waynette had been with him all through this. You know, she was engaged to him at the time. And that was another thing why Calvin didn't want to tell anybody, because he was weeks away from getting married. Waynette was only 16, so he needed parental permission to marry. And he thought, if her father finds out about this, there's no way he's going to let me marry Waynette, you know. And initially, while they're in, you know, at that location, they decided not to tell anybody. It's only as they're driving home that Charlie has a change of heart and says, "No, son, we've got to tell somebody. What if this happens to someone else? What if it's an invasion?" So Calvin agrees, but on one condition. He'll say, "I saw this thing, I saw the creatures come out, and that's it." I'll say, "I blacked out at that point and I can't remember anything else." So they phoned Keesler Air Force Base first to pull in a little convenience store. Keesler said, "We're not in the UFO business anymore. Phone your local authorities." They ring law enforcement and the sheriff comes out and escorts them into town. Rather ironically, the following day, after all this, they go back to work. They thought, you know, nobody knows about it, but the story had got out. They were sent to the Singing River Hospital for a checkup. Somebody then said, what about radiation? And the hospital couldn't check for that, but Keesler can. So they phoned Keesler Air Force Base, did the sheriff, and sheriff escorted them to Keesler, checked them with the Geiger counter. There was no radiation, but they said, "Why are you here, guys? Why don't you tell us what happened?" Rather ironic, they'd phoned you buggers the first thing the night before, and you told them to get lost, you know? And we have that interview at Keesler Air Force Base. They didn't have a recording, they had a stenographer. And we have a 17-page unredacted transcript of what was said, all the officers that were there, the police, etc. You know, and it's fascinating. And all of that is in the book.
Yeah, and even I think Calvin was mentioning that the truck or something, there was damage to the truck, or the windshield was busted, or something had happened.
Well, Calvin had bought a brand new car. And he told me what it is, but it's an American thing. So it's a Ford something or other, you know, but it was brand new. And this made me laugh. We joked about it. It was bright yellow in colour. Yes. I couldn't imagine Calvin driving a bright yellow car, but he just shook his head. He said, "I was only 18, you know, forgive me." Anyway, when they staggered back to the car, Charlie went to open the passenger door and all the window fell out. It was shattered. Again, this is a brand new automobile. Calvin said it took me at least 20 attempts to start it. 20 attempts.
Yeah.
I think in the following days when he went home, him and his brother Ricky checked it out, and the spark plugs were burnt out. That's why it wouldn't start. So he changed the spark plugs and everything seemed to be okay. So what is also interesting, and this is where Irena comes in, she got involved in the incident maybe right at the very time. She didn't quite realize it. So Maria, tell them about what I call the sonic boom. You don't call the sonic boom, but tell them about the noise of that night in 1973.
Well, they say about UFOs that the reason nobody accepts is because there's no evidence. Well, I think this is real scientific evidence that something happened, and that was that on that day, the 11th of October, 1973, that evening, I got a phone call from my mother, who lived about 600 miles away. And she said, "Did you hear that sound?" And I told her she was crazy and laughed and everything, but she seemed perfectly serious. And she's a skeptic and everything. And then a few days later, she called and said there was this huge UFO wave that people were hiding in their basements and keeping their kids in. And it sounded like a war. Well, I didn't pay attention to it. And several years later, I was at, she lived in Ohio. I was at the Ohio State University Library. And just for an impulse, I decided to go in and see if I could find when that happened, because they had a newspaper room with actual newspapers. And I didn't remember the date. I just remembered like maybe it was the middle of October. And so I thought I'd never find it because there are a million newspapers. And I found it pretty fast. I was going to give it up in about 3 papers, and I found it. And it just a little note that said about this sonic boom. Well, I was curious because, well, my mother was a skeptic. I wondered why on earth she did that, because it was just strange for her. And so I started investigating, and it was they're a huge area. And I did some investigation and submitted the story to a scientific journal. And the state seismologist of Ohio happened to be interested and contacted me and helped me find seismograph records and things like that. And I published it in 1987, but then I didn't pay a bit of attention to the abduction, which might have been right at the same time as the sound. But then my last book before this had a lot about that sound. It was really strange. It had never been explained. It covered a huge area, like from Idaho to the coast that went over Washington and a whole lot of other areas. Wow. It was like about 1,000 miles long and maybe 500 miles wide. And at that distance, you'd think it would have to be way high, so high you couldn't possibly, there would be no air to cause it to spread out that much. But instead, people were running out of their houses and calling the police department and everything else. And even though it was a time when there were sonic booms, you could trace right when it happened right across with the newspapers because it was so strange. And so that happened at just about, so far as you can tell, the same time as the abduction. And there's nothing to explain it at all. There wasn't any, and nobody saw anything. There were no airplanes, no meteors or anything. And so that would be something that would be scientifically provable.
Was it a sound? Was it simultaneous at all points, or did it the sound travel?
No, I found 2 seismograph stations that reported it, and so I get the time, and it was about 3 times the speed of sound, and I could get the time right across the country and check it that way too. So I had 2 ways of checking the time.
So then it would be possible. It is possible for a human aircraft to travel fast enough to create a sonic boom, but not one that has the spread of, how many miles did you say across it was?
Yeah, since then they've published how wide a sonic boom is, and like if you're at 80,000 feet, it's only like 80 miles at 40 on either side, and this was huge compared to that.
Yeah, you said hundreds of miles or something.
Yeah. 1,000 miles.
1,000 miles long, and then the width was
500.
In some places it looked like it went from Tennessee to New York, and it looked like it could have been around 500 miles wide, which was way more than a jet plane. And there were some jet planes that went close to that time, and people identified them, and they were in the paper, and you could see about how wide their sonic boom was. And this was nothing like that. This was much bigger.
And can a sonic boom normally be seen on a seismograph?
No. Yeah, I mean, this one was. Usually they don't get on a seismograph at all. But this one...
I was wondering if that was normal. I've never heard of seismographic records of sonic booms alone.
But this was on 2.
Oh, yeah. Wow. And even 80,000 feet, what, you're looking at space at that point, aren't you? Like that's, that's so any higher than that to get a biggest or bigger cone of volume doesn't make sense because there'd be no air, right?
What we did, gentlemen, again, we put this into the book. It's written purely by Dr. Scott, not me, and it's there and you can refer to it or not, but it's one of these things again that happened on that night. Okay, in a different part, further over in geographically. But is there a connection? I don't know. We don't know, but we
take all the data. right?
Yeah, we just present it. It's like when you're doing a criminal case. You just, this is all the stuff we've got. This will convict him. That won't. This is irrelevant. We should use that.
Could be connected, could not be connected, right?
Yeah,
Keep your options open.
Yeah.
The book, guys, is called Beyond Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. Please pick it up because this will be a very, well, there you go. If you're watching the video, Irena Scott is holding the book right now. But
Great
it's
cover art, by the way.
Yeah, it's awesome. But it's a great way to know this abduction phenomenon in depthly. And there's more players and there's 2 more abductees that I've never heard of. And it's very interesting because it raises the question of whether or not when they come to take somebody, they sort of pick multiple people at the same run, or do they come specifically for one set of people? We don't know, but this is very interesting. A very great case. And like I said, I feel lucky to have talked to Calvin at least before he passed away. And that episode's in the 68th episode, I think, something like that, of UAP Studies podcast. But this case is phenomenally one of my best cases that I know of. I mean, it's solid in the fact that they remember what took place. Super important. If somebody wants to reach out to either one of you regarding this case, where can they reach out? Where can they find you guys?
Yeah, well, I run a little publisher called Flying Disc Press. Find me at flyingdiscpress.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter or X or whatever name you want to give it. So I'm easy to find, and Irena will tell you her details.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook under Irena Scott, and I'm in Ohio, so I guess I'm easy to find there. People can send a message.
Yeah, and I added you, I believe, on Facebook as well recently, Irena. So I got you and Philip. Yeah, and the podcast. So you're part of the group, part of the family now. Michael, do you have any final questions for our guest today?
My traditional final question is always, what are your reading recommendations for audience members who want to understand the phenomenon in the way that you do?
That's a good question. I mean, it's always very subjective. Is what books you like, what TV shows you like. When it comes to the abduction phenomena, I've always recommended Bud Hopkins' first book, which is called Missing Time. And that was republished last year. So you can get a brand new copy of it. You don't have to hunt around for a second-hand copy. And it's Bud's introduction to the subject and how he got involved. And it's one of the few books that I've read several times. So on the abduction subject, I would recommend that to anyone. As well as ours, of course. If you're interested in the phenomenon in the UK, there's my book, Without Consent. And that is purely UK cases. And the reason I kept to UK cases was to show that they do happen in other countries. It's not just in the United States. These bizarre things happen here as well. And here's examples of them. So, I'm being subjective there. With Buds, and
that's what I want. I want to know your personal.
I think it's a fantastic book, and I was fortunate enough to get to meet Bud and become friends with him. He stayed at my house, and I found him a fascinating gentleman. And I'm sorry he's not here, but I would recommend Missing Time to anyone.
Dr. Scott, do you have recommendations on good materials?
I'd say Missing Time too, but I'd also say my book called Beyond Pascagoula, which goes into detail about the sound, which may be boring, but it was a physical problem to solve, and there was a lot of information that would hold up scientifically.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. That's exactly the sort of data that a lot of our listeners are really interested in digging into. So,
I would say to your listeners as well, stay tuned, because we do have other interviews that we've conducted. We have these tapes that we've recently found.
We've got a documentary coming out.
We've got 2 documentaries coming out. We've got one made, and we're making another one with Darcy Weir, a Canadian gentleman.
Let's just down the road. Yeah.
Yeah. So stay tuned. We will release it all at some point. It's just thinking about the best way to do it to make it as widely available as possible. I mean, some of these hypnosis tapes are, an hour or so long. So to stick that on our website is going to, I'm not so sure if it's the right thing to do. So we're having thoughts about it, and we haven't come up with a conclusion yet. But when we do, we'll let you know.
Well, we look forward to it. When you do, we'll post an update and make sure everybody knows where to find it. Thank you so much for being here. This was
awesome, guys. Great episode. Guys, I highly encourage you to go seek out this book and help out these two amazing people, and just spreading the word out about this case. This case is valid, and to me is in the top 5 cases so far that I love.
Platinum.
Right. Yeah. They're platinum cases. So I encourage that. If you are following us on Spotify, please do us a favor, go to YouTube, help us out. We had to restart the channel, but if you guys help us out with the subscriptions, we'll boost it back up to where it's supposed to go. And we'll be back with another episode of UAP Studies shortly. I appreciate your time, Philip and Irena. Michael, I appreciate it always. And this was a great time, guys. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.